Hi, welcome to True Creeps, where the stories are true and the creeps are real. We'll cover stories from grotesque gore to the possibly plausible paranormal, to horrifying history, to tense and terrible true crime, and everything else that goes bump in the night. We're your hosts, Amanda,
and I'm Lindsay, and we want you to join us while we creep.
We cover mature topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about the Spanish Inquisition.
It seems so random, but it makes sense.
It is random. We're covering this as part of our mushroom series. It's kind of a little bit of background-ish because one of the next things we're going to talk about in that series is sacred mushroom practices in Mexico. In order to understand the secrecy behind them, it's very important to understand how brutal the Spanish Inquisition was and how cultural practices that were outside of traditional Catholicism were kind of stamped out and it became dangerous to do them. And so we're going to talk broadly about the Spanish Inquisition, but then dig into more details when we talk about punishments people faced and then some specifics of the Spanish Inquisition when it was in Mexico, which is the Mexican Inquisition. So that's one of the reasons we're talking about it today. Also, as a note, it's not in our outline. When we first started True Creeps, my dad was like, you should do an episode on the Spanish Inquisition. Doing the research for the Sacred Mushroom episode that we're going to talk about, it became clear that there was this huge impact because of it. And I was like, well, perhaps we could do like some background at the top of that episode, but that episode's going to be long enough. And we were like, well, there's a lot to talk about the Spanish Inquisition, so it can have its own episode. But today will likely be a little bit shorter because it's very history heavy.
We said we cover weird history, so weird and scary history is part of it.
And so diving right into it, when we talk about inquisitions, we're not just talking about the practice of like religious persecution broadly. We're talking about a narrow scope of acts that were basically approved by the Vatican. And while the Spanish Inquisition is not the first Inquisition, it's the one we're going to talk about today. The Inquisitions for the Roman Catholic Church started in like the 1100s. And it wasn't as though they were like, and now we're going to start forcing everyone into our religion. Like they had some stuff going on before then. Mm-hmm. It was brutal. It was bloody. It was awful. Even before the Spanish Inquisition came. But so the Spanish Inquisition itself spanned from 1478 to 1834. Its purpose was to find quote unquote heretics, but it also had the latent effect of consolidating power underneath the Spanish monarchy. Because at that time, the two monarchs, and it was King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella, their particular kingdoms were uniting. And so the Inquisition helped unite Spain a bit, from what I understand. The Spanish Inquisition also went to Spanish colonies, which were in Peru, Italy, and Mexico. And when the Spanish Inquisition began, it began after Pope Sixtus IV issued a decree to the Spanish monarchs saying, okay, you guys can combat heresy. We don't like it when people are heretics. And by heretics, we mean anybody who's not super Catholic or who does anything we don't like, basically.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot. So the Spanish monarchy wanted their kingdom to be Christian, specifically Catholic. And what's hard about this is that they already had a relatively religiously diverse population of people. So there were Muslim people and there were Jewish people. They weren't being kind to them, but they were existing in the country, in the colonies before this. It's like they're all of a sudden like, okay, now it's a big fucking problem. Like it was a problem before, but it's a big problem now. Before the Inquisition even began, Jewish people were being forced to convert to Christianity or be executed.
Hate it.
Which just like, if you want someone to like join your team, the best way to do it is to not be like, I'm going to kill you if you don't. Because then are they really on your team or are they just trying to not die?
Right.
And so Jewish people that converted were known as conversos in Spain. So they had like a particular name for them. So it doesn't really feel so, hey, we're welcoming you into our religion. It's like, we're forcing you, but then we're going to be mad about it.
Mm-hmm. And then we're going to still keep you kind of separate.
Yes.
So King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella of Spain were incredibly suspicious of them. And so, yeah, they gave them their own name so that they could pinpoint who they were. Many of the powerful Christian families in Spain were suspicious of them as well and believed that the conversos were responsible for corruption within the Catholic Church in Spain. They also believed that they were still practicing Judaism in secret. Suspicion against conversos began to deepen And they were blamed for things like illnesses, plagues, abducting Christian boys, and poisoning people's water. Pretty specific. Ferdinand and Isabella were pressured to draw a harder line against the conversos by powerful families and wanting those families' support in their crusades to exile Muslims in Granada. Ferdinand decided an inquisition would appease the wealthy families, and in doing so, they would seize the wealth of the conversos to fund the crusade against Muslims.
Fucked, right?
Yeah. They're like, well, you can't help us in one way.
Yeah. Well, and also, as an important note, because we'll talk about it later, but during the Inquisition, one of the things that they would do is they would seize people's property if they were alleged or confessed heretics. So it became a very profitable way of being an asshole.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. In 1481, about 20,000 conversos attempted to avoid execution by confessing, but they were required to name other heretics. This resulted in hundreds of executions. Pope Sixtus encountered conversos that had left Spain and said that the Spanish Inquisition was too harsh.
How bad are these experiences that he's hearing if a pope who is the religious party who is like giving a stamp of approval for inquisitions generally is like, ugh, this is too much.
Right. So Pope Sixtus also said that they were wrongfully accusing conversos. So he formed a council in 1482 to run the Inquisition. The first Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, was named by the Spanish government under the authorization of Pope Sixtus IV. He formed courts that made things more uniform. Over his tenure, he outlined the crimes inquisitors could investigate, interrogation methods, and punishment. Torquemada was known to be very brutal. He encouraged both confiscation of land as well as physical torture to intimidate those that were being investigated.
And interestingly, he was also involved even before he was named like first Grand Inquisitor. So he was still like part of the extra brutal part. Not that it wasn't all brutal, but he was still involved. Like it wasn't like he just started then. He got a title.
Yeah.
They would have elaborate public events where they would list off those who were like condemned as heretics through interrogations. And they were called autos de fe. And they would have processions, oaths of obedience to the Inquisition, and sermons. They would march out all of the alleged and confessed heretics. And when they would be wearing like a sack over their head where there was like one eye hole. Weird.
Mm-hmm.
As part of these, people would be getting sentences. And the sentences were often not carried out by the inquisitors themselves, but rather like the local authorities. So the religious power in these communities was so strong that they were directing local, like smaller governments, if you will, to be like, okay, this person's going to go for life imprisonment. This person's going to die. Wild. The first of the auto de fe was held on February 6th of 1481. Also, as an important note, alleged heretics that refused to confess were often executed by being burned at the stake. While Torquemada, who Amanda mentioned earlier was very brutal, was Grand Inquisitor, approximately 2,000 people were burned at the stake.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of fucking people. In 1492, the Spanish monarchy issued the Alhambra Decree, which was influenced heavily by Torquemada. This decree gave Jewish people the decision to either convert to Christianity or to be expelled from Spain. Doesn't matter how long you've lived there. Doesn't matter that's where you grew up. Expelled. It's just fucking insane. Like,
so ridiculous. Yeah.
Why? But so, not surprisingly, right? Like, the inquisitors are going to different towns. Inquisition is in like full steam. People are not fucking happy about this. So at one point, 2 inquisitors were murdered. One was poisoned, another one was stabbed. And then Torquemada rounded up all of the people who he thought might be assassins and burned them all at the stake.
Sounds insane.
Yes.
Like drunk with power, right?
Yes. Like, exactly. And so eventually, Torquemada began investigating members of the clergy as heretics. Because again, remember, one of the reasons that they didn't like conversos was they were saying there's corruption within the Catholic Church. And so they were like, maybe this is your fault. So he starts looking kind of inward, and Pope Alexander VI is like, no. So what he does is he forces Torquemada to share leadership of the Inquisition with 4 other clergymen. So he isn't just in charge of everything himself.
Right. take him down a notch.
Yeah. So another Grand Inquisitor, Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, sought to have the Muslim population expelled. And by 1609, Islam was banned in Spain. Then, in 1614, about 300,000 Spanish Muslims were expelled. This particular population of Muslims many of them had already agreed to convert to Christianity and be baptized, but they were like, no, get out. Like where they actually gave Jewish people the option to convert, they did not give that same opportunity, I want to say, because they quote unquote said you could convert if you were Jewish, but then just didn't believe you and would
still be awful to you.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem like there was any fucking winning here. Some of the people of that 300,000 did agree to convert, but were still expelled. But there were also tens of thousands of Muslims who were executed for refusing to convert to Christianity or to leave Spain.
Right. They were just given this choice that they didn't ask for.
Exactly. After the Jewish population is expelled and after the Muslim population is expelled, inquisitors begin to set their sights on non-Catholic Christians to persecute. Not that they were nice to them before either, but now they're like, okay, now you have to be Catholic. Because, now I feel like people who are Christian are like, maybe they don't agree with other forms of Christianity as much, but they're not bloody about it so much. There was a time when being a Presbyterian versus being Catholic was like end of the world.
Mm-hmm. During the Inquisitions, those in power had the authority to interrogate alleged heretics about their loyalties and religious practices. Those who were questioned really had no rights. Seems like no one really had rights except for whoever thought was right at the time.
Yeah.
When inquisitors came to a town, they would announce who they were and give residents the opportunity to confess to their heresy. Individuals who confessed to heresy were then punished. And this would range from a pilgrimage to public whippings. So, not easy, right?
No winning here.
Yeah, exactly. Residents would then accuse one another of being a heretic. And that might be just to get the attention off themselves, which is also really sad, that they felt like they had to do that to their neighbor.
Exactly. And often when somebody was accusing someone else, it was in the context of terrible things happening to them.
Mm-hmm.
Or because they were scared, right? Just as you said. So just fucked up in every way.
If a person was accused, the inquisitors would seize you from your home without warning and bring you to the high tribunal of the Holy Office. You would be given a monk's habit and would be shackled. Next, you would appear before the tribunal, and then you would be accused of being a heretic. If you were accused of being a heretic, you were not given the opportunity to have counsel or representative of any kind. Also, just another horrible part of this, you were not even told why you were being accused of heresy. If it was something in particular that you did that made people suspect you, you would never figure that out. No one would ever tell you.
How maddening.
And they're like,
Because at least if someone told you, you could be like, oh, yeah, it did seem like I was insert thing that would make someone suspicious of you of becoming a heretic. But it wasn't me doing a religious practice. It was because I was pouring water out and it happened to be a full moon.
And then, on top of all of this, if you were the one accused and you didn't immediately confess, you would then be tortured and possibly executed. Sometimes, even those that did confess to being a heretic were still tortured and or executed anyways. So, no matter what you did, you were kind of fucked.
Sometimes when you confess to being a heretic, they were like, okay, you're a heretic, so you have heretic friends. Tell us about them. So they would then torture you so that you would tell them more, which is just wild. Also, it seems like you could go through this process more than once. So they're like, you're a repeat offender. You're actually a heretic. You just lied before. So then they do the whole thing again.
Terrible.
This is also the point of the episode where I tell you that Moo is snoring.
I could see her this time on camera. Yeah.
You also might hear birds because the birds at my house outside, I don't have birds as pets. The birds outside are so fucking loud that I was Googling birds in vents. I thought birds were living in my vents because they were that fucking loud. And then yesterday, Ben was like, I actually think that it's just the birds being loud because I saw Santa, our lovely elderly neighbor. She was standing on something that she should not be standing on, a step stool at the top of it outside, and she's banging on the vents outside of her house. he was like, I think that she's hearing the birds being loud too and is thinking they're in her vents. So all that to say, the birds are really fucking loud. I can't do anything about it. I'm in my basement right now and they're still that loud. So,
oh yeah, I had a trash truck that was just going down the street over and over again. So
birds snoring. Maybe Amanda's trash truck at some point. Who could say? So we were talking about torture. Let's talk about torture methods. The use of torture was typically used to extract information from alleged heretics. So it wasn't being used necessarily as a penalty, but rather a means to an end. Not that that makes it okay, but it is what that's what it was for. So let's talk about some of the ways that they tortured people. Starvation. They would pile burning coals onto their body. Waterboarding. They also had a type of like a torture mechanism practice that they called strappado. I believe this is a type of torture that started in the medieval Inquisition, and it was a practice that carried on through. So basically what would happen is a person's arms would be tied behind their back, and the rope that they used would have like, your hands tied to one end and then a long rope. So the long part of the rope will be thrown over a brace in the ceiling. So they basically make a pulley system, and then they would start to pull the long part of the rope so that your arms, which were behind your back, started to get pulled up slowly. Eventually, a person's shoulders would dislocate, but they wouldn't just do this in like one full swoop. They would do it slowly and in jerking methods, and sometimes they would give it more slack and then do it again. So it was incredibly painful.
Horrible.
Yes. And then sometimes, to make it even worse, they would add weights to the victim's feet or ankles.
Ugh. Have you ever been to one of the torture museums?
Yes, I find them fascinating.
Yeah, horrific. Like some of them have some of these devices where you can still see like how they worked, and they'll have artwork depicting on how all of this is, and seeing all of that is just insane.
One of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by torture and like torture museums and things like that is because I just can't fathom anything that would make me think it was okay to do that to another person. And my mind also couldn't like devise of these like different, novel, unique ways of hurting someone.
Yeah, because you're not insane. So another device that was used was called the rack, and a person would be affixed to a metal or wooden frame that had rollers on one or both ends of the frame. The rollers would then turn, which would then pull the restraints on the victim. This would eventually cause their joints to dislocate, and if the torture continued, the person's limbs would be ripped off. Sometimes just seeing this being done to someone else was motivation enough for a person to confess.
You bet your bippy it would be.
But even after that, though, that doesn't mean that they're safe.
No, it doesn't mean that they're safe, but I feel like they could probably have like one person they're doing this to and 10 people who are watching, and they're like, I'd rather not have that happen. I would also say, like, I feel like the rack is one that, like, most people, if you have heard of torture things, like, you've probably heard of that. This next one I had never heard of, and I was like, oh, I mean, not surprisingly, fucking hate it.
There's actually a similar thing to the rack in a horror game.
Oh, really? Which one?
Called Fatal Frame. And they would like sacrifice someone, but they'd like pull them apart essentially to like hold it's been a long time, but I think to hold like the gates to hell closed. They would like rip them apart on it, and they would be like, they'd call them the Shrine Maiden. It's fucked, but it's a very good game.
The Shrine Maiden.
Anyways, so the next one is called the wheel, and the victim would be stretched over a wagon wheel and bound to it. The torturers would then beat them with a club or something similar. The wheel has like holes. There's like beams in the middle, but like not all around. So when they would be hit with something and that part of the body was on one of those open spaces, it would usually break their bones when they were struck.
Yeah, and that's mostly open space, right? Like it's more open space than it is spokes.
Right. This was used for both general torture and for execution. So like they would just keep going until the person died.
Yeah.
When used for execution, sometimes the victims would be left on display while they slowly died. So like another message to the rest of the people. And then to add more terribleness to this, sometimes while they were using these methods, they would also use devices to mutilate or cause further pain, like heated metal pincers.
Fuck. All of these seem bad enough. And then you're like, and we're going to put weird pincers on you that are fucking burning you. Ugh.
Yeah.
Okay. We have talked about the Spanish Inquisition broadly, why they're doing it, broadly what's going on and then how they're doing it. Now we're going to start to shift to our like prequel to our sacred mushroom part. And it's the Spanish Inquisition, specifically in Mexico. There is so much more about the Spanish Inquisition to talk about and that happened, but we're using this as kind of a prequel, if you will, / like possible standalone episode. If you're like, I don't give a fuck about sacred mushrooms, I only want to know about the Spanish Inquisition, let's fucking go. You probably won't be as happy if that's what you're here for, and I'm so sorry. But we're now moving to the part where we're talking about its impact in Mexico and how it was a little bit different there. So Spanish Inquisition in Mexico is called the Mexican Inquisition, and it was an expansion. It began in 1571. 3 years later, in 1574, the first auto de fe in Mexico occurred. Now, earlier we talked about how the Spanish Inquisition was like focused on finding heretics. Mm-hmm. And often there it was really people who they thought were practicing a different religion. But when it came to colonial Mexico, it did a bit more than impose Catholic orthodoxy on the people. It was a bit different because it went after people for drug use, which could be any number of substances, including psychedelics, sexual practices, and what they perceived as witchcraft. And there might be overlap in some of these things. The Mexican Inquisition only had jurisdiction over baptized Catholics, which at first you're like, okay, if you're not Catholic, you're, as the kids say, they probably don't say this anymore, Gucci, but like you're fine, right? Like you're going to be fine if you're not Catholic. You're not, but we'll get to it. They also were originally unable to try indigenous populations in Mexico. Specifically per an edict in 1569, the Inquisition in what they called New Spain could legally not try native Mesoamericans if they had not converted to Catholicism. But, one, that's a very narrow description.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And built into this, there's some assumptions, and it's that people could choose to not be Catholic and to choose to not be baptized. But there was also exceptions to this kind of broad rule. And one of those was that in the particular village, town area, if the bishop that was there, like the Catholic bishop, mm-hmm. lived 2 or more days away from the village, the inquisitors could then use what would be the bishop's authority in that jurisdiction.
So if he's not close enough, then they're like, okay, well, we can do more.
Mm-hmm. Or if for whatever reason he is like unable to perform his duties. And so they would have all of the power of a bishop in an area, which, as we mentioned before, in Spain, and then by extension in the colonies, religious groups had power, like disproportionate power over local governments.
They still do.
Yeah, I mean, they still do, but not like this.
Right. That was just a jab.
They had more power, and so then the Inquisition had even more power. So when the Mexican Inquisition started, there was the Tribunal of the Holy Office of Inquisition, which was opened there. And there had been like persecution and like Inquisition-esque things going on before like the official start of the Inquisition in Mexico, because the Spanish Inquisition had started almost actually, I believe more than a full century before that. So there's this rule, right? Like, oh, you can't try indigenous populations, but you could investigate them. And I thought that was interesting because why would you waste time investigating a population that you can't bring charges against?
I mean, yeah, and depending on what their investigation methods were, they could get away with a lot.
Exactly. One of the reasons why there was this carve out and like that quote unquote you couldn't try indigenous populations is because Spain's monarch was worried that there would be upheaval in the Mexican colonies. And so they were like, okay, we're not going to try you, in quotes, right? If you don't fall under our jurisdiction, quote unquote.
So a moment ago, we said that they only had jurisdiction over like baptized people, almost like they had a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Local priests and Catholic missionaries campaigned to remove any indigenous idolatry from the colonies. This resulted in religious sites and native texts being destroyed. Many native Mesoamericans were forced to convert to Christianity, which then put them within the scope of the Spanish Inquisition. However, by the 17th century, inquisitors began to realize that while they had thought that they had successfully stamped out the indigenous spiritual practices, they actually hadn't. They also realized that more powerful families within these indigenous communities had secreted away the religious texts to protect them, so they weren't actually destroyed.
I fucking love this for them.
Yeah, they're like, no, you're not getting this. This is ours.
Mm-hmm.
Even as Mesoamericans converted to Catholicism, they practiced it differently than their European counterparts. Specifically, while they followed Catholicism and its doctrines, they also adhered to pagan rituals and beliefs as well, which like a lot of them already are, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, some of them already are, but I will point out that one of the really interesting things about Christianity, Catholicism, is that if you're thinking of like, what does it mean to convert? It means that you're going to like publicly agree to that, like you believe these things, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you're going to agree to, I mean, if you're Catholic, you're going to take the Eucharist, you're going to take the sacraments, right? And you're going to believe that that is the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah.
And so they're agreeing like, okay, we'll be Catholic. We will do it how you say. Sure. But then they keep their like folk practices that are at the core of who they are in a way that I think is it's an interesting blend of two different religions. And we'll talk about that more in our episode on the sacred mushrooms in Mexico, that the people who adopted these like Catholic practices, they didn't always just abandon their previous like religious inclinations. They were just like, we'll take your stuff in too. We'll do our practices in your manner, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So when we were saying that they were like following Catholicism, but they would also have some pagan rituals and beliefs, not surprisingly, this pissed people off, right? So the missionaries, friars, and priests were super unhappy about it.
Shocker here, right?
They're unhappy all the time.
Yeah. Earlier we mentioned the scope of the Mexican Inquisition and how it involved things other than just like what they had seen in Europe as what might be a heretic. But one of the novel issues that arose for inquisitors was the use of hallucinogenic plants, specifically their religious use, because it's not just that people were trying to have a good time. It was very much a spiritual practice and still is for many people. And by the 17th century, despite the Spanish Inquisition still going, the Mexican Inquisition still going, the religious use of hallucinogens had spread to the non-indigenous populations. So not only did they not stamp it out, this practice, fully in indigenous populations, but they didn't stop its growth. So by the 18th century, the Inquisition's fight against hallucinogens began to amp up, but this is also when the Spanish Inquisition was starting to decline in power. So, a few minutes ago, forever, throughout the episode, we've been mentioning that the reason we're talking about the Spanish Inquisition is to give a context for why sacred mushroom rituals in Mexico became so secret and or stopped for different periods of time, and the damage that was done to those practices throughout generations. So we're going to wrap up our discussion of Spanish Inquisition because, as you've noticed, we've gotten there. We've talked about the why of the Spanish Inquisition, the who, what was happening, how it was happening, and what it looked like in Mexico. So we're in a good spot to pause in case we ever do another Spanish Inquisition episode, but I don't think we will. I think this is it, guys. But there were two attempts to end the Spanish Inquisition and its offshoots, which were in the colonies, before it eventually ended in 1834. And the reason it ended, there was a few different reasons, but the predominantly accepted ones from what we could see was that the Enlightenment period began to spread in Spain in the 18th century. And as this spread, this and other more liberal political ideologies led to the populace being less supportive of this practice.
Mm-hmm.
Also, again, the Inquisition, stamp approved, right, from the Catholic Church, and was conducted by the monarchy. But both of these institutions had changed in society, and they had become less central and less powerful than they once were. So their reach started to limit, and little by little that happened. So over time, eventually, it did end, and it ended by a decree, but it took a long fucking time.
Yeah, too long.
Yeah. So we never really planned on doing a Spanish Inquisition episode, but I felt like it was necessary as we talked about the sacred mushroom and like why it went away for a bit. But once I delved into this particular special interest of mushrooms, what can't we learn, Amanda? What can't I drag you into?
She's like, Amanda, we're going to do mushrooms. And then I'm like, okay. And then she's like, Amanda, we're going to do like 100 mushroom episodes. And I was like, okay. This is going to be like our ghosts, like our hauntings, right? It's going to be, there's so much with mushrooms. Cause I was like, okay, mushrooms, 1 or 2. And then she's like, no, there's so many. And now that we've been researching, and I was like, oh, okay, I see it. Like mushrooms are fucking weird and they're everywhere. They're in history. They're in poison. They're in, like all of our different themes that we've done.
Mm-hmm.
There's mushrooms somewhere in there.
Yeah, there's mushroom true crime.
Yeah.
There's mushroom ghosts, I'm sure of it.
That's going to be the tough one to research. Haunted mushrooms.
Maybe that's where mushrooms will start to sparkle for you, is if you can find like mushroom ghost demons.
I'm sure.
I think that'll get you pro mushroom.
And so with that being said, we're going to have so many mushroom episodes. Our mushroom episodes can be listened to together or individually. But for those just joining us, this is our second one. We have a few more coming up, obviously, and they won't be one after another. They're going to be sprinkled between all of our other themes that we do.
Yeah, so if you're not like vibing with mushrooms, don't leave for 5 months while we unpack all of our mushroom facts.
Yeah. There's going to be more. There's going to be ghosts. There's going to be true crime. There's going to be all kinds of stuff. There's going to be
all the things.
All of our topics. So with that, this is the end of our second mushroom episode. Also, if there's any mushroom stuff that you want to know about, or you've heard something about mushrooms that seems weird or interesting, let us know. Reach out to us because we might be able to add it into an episode.
Yeah.
And with that, have a great weekend.
Thanks for creeping with us. Thanks for listening. And as always, a special thank you to our patrons who support us via Patreon.
Please see the link in our show notes to learn more about how you, yes you, can begin to haunt the dump, guard vortexes, or even become a scorching Sasquatch.
Ooh. Also in our show notes, you can find the link to our website, more information on our sources, our social media handles, and our merch store.
We'd love for you to keep creeping with us. So if you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the show with your fellow creeps and or ghosts.
I beg of you. I mean, and like nowadays, you're gonna watch Marley and Me, Hachi, Homeward Bound on a fucking loop. Done. I'll tell you whatever you need to know.
Oh, see, you are doing it though. That's torture.
No, I'm just like that. But sad dog movies is like, I'm like, that's enough. I'll tell you whatever you need. Like,
oh yeah, that's terrible. That's terrible. We could put this at the end.
Yeah.
Someone recommended me to watch a new horror series, right?
Which one?
Them, the Scare.
Okay.
It's like horror, but it's also a lot more to it, right? And I was like, okay, yeah, like it has great reviews, like absolutely. So I have to choose what I want to watch carefully because I only have so much time to watch something.
No, I understand.
So it has to be a winner, right? And it is very good. But the first episode, I see a dog and I was like, fuck.
Yeah.
So I go to doesthedogdie.com.
As one does.
And I look and it says no, right? But I did it very quickly because I'm trying to watch what's happening. And there's a lot of like, you have to pay attention for the show. You can't be playing on your phone or anything. So I'm watching and then I'm like, but wait, why is the dog's collar there? I should spoil this. People should know the dog.
No, don't spoil it. Don't spoil it.
Okay, well, without giving spoilers, other than there is something that happens to the fucking dog. And then I looked and I was like, how dare them lie to me?
Yeah, you're like, I hold you above most other news sources.
Yes.
The trust you give them is so real.
Yes. Like I look at that before I even go see a horror movie. And then I realized that it was my own fault that when I clicked it, it was showing me season 2.
Oh.
And I felt so betrayed.
Have you watched the show From? Speaking of horror series.
No.
That's a very good one. You should add that to your list. First season is better than the second season so far, but it's fascinating and it's kind of a novel idea.
Okay.
I also, over the weekend, I went and saw the new Strangers movie.
I haven't heard good things.
I need to preface that do I love a spooky topic? Yes. Do I like a spooky ghost place in real life? Yes. Am I an absolute little baby? Also, yes. I spent the majority of the movie with my flannel over my face.
Really?
Yes.
I haven't had a movie do that for a while.
Because there's a lot of suspense.
Oh, okay. I said I haven't had a movie do that for a long time.
Yeah, like there was so many like something's gonna happen, something's gonna happen, something's gonna happen moments. And I was like I was exhausted by the end of it. Just like full on exhausted just from like stress.
Interesting. I mean, I would love to see it. I have to probably wait till it comes out.
I think it would be fine to see at home. Like I don't think there's anything like big enough where you're like, oh, I want to see that on the big screen.
I saw If.
How was that?
It was a little slow to start, but overall pretty good. I mean, Oliver got a little bored towards the like beginning, middle.
Yeah, well, I've heard like it's not really for kids.
Yeah, but at the end, like he liked it, but he was like, it was too sad.
Yo, baby.
And it was too sad. It was it was good overall, though. I'd recommend seeing it.
Have you watched Knock at the Cabin?
Mm-mm.
It's interesting.
If I watch something horror, it has to be after like 9 p.m. and I have like an hour.
Yeah, no, I understand. I like horror stuff, like spooky stuff, but sometimes like I also just like need a break. And like I had like honestly just like a full on fucking meltdown because I thought I hurt my cat earlier this week. And I was just like so emotionally exhausted from it, which like it was nothing. He got trapped in like a drawer and then he ran, but I couldn't find him. So I was like, he's dead. I've killed him. He was fine. I just had really big feelings and I was scared because I've had a lot of like cat loss in the past year. And I was just like, I cannot handle this. So like the crying was like happening and I couldn't stop once I knew he was safe. Like I just like my brain was like, my body hadn't caught up. Like it was just like, we're still feeling it. But so like, after that, I was like, let's watch a horror movie that night. And I was like, okay. And then the next, like last night, he was like, do you want to watch a movie? And I was like, yeah, but can it like be a little bit lighter? And he's like, yeah, like, and he like is still in spooky movies. And I'm like, okay, go down one, go to the right one, go to the right another one, until basically I just directed him to go to the new Anne Hathaway movie. Also very cute. I cried because I cried everything. But I was like, I just need like a minute. Like I need a minute because I'm emotionally exhausted. All that to say that, you know, it's an interesting movie, though, the M. Night Shyamalan one.
I have a list now on my phone of things when I'm like, oh, I have time to watch something. And normally, like, when we take our 2-week break in the summer, that'll be like what I can do instead of doing research or editing, you know?
Yeah.